Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special discussion where I have digital Hammurabi and Skylar. Hopefully that this is the way that you guys wanted to be identified tonight, because I've already done it and there's no going back. And we're going to be talking about slavery in the Bible. This is a fascinating subject, because all the believers want to say that there's a lot of things in the Bible that believers want to insist is not there, and slavery is right up there. As a matter of fact, I was talking to a guy, non sequitur show. Kyle said that the thing that converted him was discovering when he heard me one day on a video that somebody else was playing with at his work, and I was talking about slavery in the Bible, and Kyle overheard me on that video saying this thing about slavery. He says, "There's no slavery in the Bible." He goes back and he tries to disprove it, and he can't disprove it. In fact, he proved to himself that it actually was there. So what do you do with that? And that was the thing that Kyle said crumbled his faith. So, boys, we're going to crumble some faith today.
I hope so.
All right, let's get on it. Skylar, I want you to open up with your introduction, and then we'll turn over to Josh.
Yeah. Well, I'm Skylar Fiction. I run a YouTube channel where I host mostly Christians on the channel for discussions. Where we oftentimes challenge a lot of their ideas about the Bible, about Scripture. I ask questions about why they believe the things they do, and things like that. And of course, Dr. Josh and I will often host Bible studies also, because we're really big on the important context and the history of everything. We want people, especially atheists, people who are non-believers, to be informed about why they do have certain beliefs, especially if they're going to argue with Christians. I want them to be very much prepared for the arguments. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I've been doing this about 5 years. It's been a great run. Just excited to be on your channel tonight, by the way, man. You know, before I started my channel years ago, you were one of the people that I watched debate over and over again, different theists, and you're just so good at it. And I learned a lot from you.
Smoke. Let's save that for another time. Okay?
I'm just saying. I never got to talk to you. I just need to get that out. Anyways, let's let Dr. Josh introduce himself.
Dr. Josh. Yeah. I like that title. Although I gotta say, I better prefer your other moniker, Digital Hammurabi.
Oh, well, yes. Thank you. Of course, I was a high school teacher for 15 years.
Don't do that. I don't want to hear that accent tonight.
No, I'm Dr. Joshua Bowen. I have a PhD in Assyriology from Johns Hopkins University, and I graciously allowed to come onto Skylar's channel very often and talk about the Bible and sort of put to use my somewhat esoteric knowledge. My wife and I, who is getting her PhD as well, we run a channel called Digital Hammurabi, where we talk about the ancient Near East and other things involved in that. So we have several videos up more recently on slavery, and of course that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So yeah, again, thank you very much, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to come back on again.
Oh no, the pleasure's mine. The pleasure's mine, boys. I'm going to enjoy this, I can tell. So we hear the arguments all the time that the Christians always denying that the biggest excuse, or I guess the most popular excuse, is that slavery in the Bible wasn't really slavery. It was like indentured servitude or some such nonsense, but it wasn't as bad as the slavery we had in the United States, because the United States, we would tie these people up and lash them. How cruel is that? But in the Bible, it certainly was much, much kinder and softer and gentler, was it not?
Bible slavery, the kinder, gentler version of slavery in world history. No, you're right. And I think the problem is like, I think it's kind of an American thing in a sense, right? So when we start talking about slavery, the initial reaction is to think about American slavery, American slave times, and the things that happened in our past. But one of the things that I think is very important for Dr. Josh and I is we basically clear out our definitions. We define them very clearly, right? A simple way, and I think the most simplest definition of a slave is somebody that is owned as property and treated as property. We don't, you could still be treated properly as property and still be kind of treated nice to some degree. I don't know. Maybe there's a contradiction in terms there, I guess.
I saw Django Unchained. I know that can happen.
Exactly. But it's also a tactic, too, to get out of really tackling the issues of what goes on in the Bible, right? And, one of the things that really kind of got me onto the slavery issue of the Bible was reading Leviticus chapter 25. And in that chapter, it so clearly articulates the many different kinds of slavery. The indentured servitude for the Israelites, for the Hebrews. And then basically the good old-fashioned kind of slavery where you just buy and own people, including children. It straight up stipulates the kind of treatment you would have for slaves. If they're non-Hebrew slaves, they can be treated with rigor. They could be purchased and kept for life, passed on to their children as permanent inheritance. And this isn't, sly dialogue in the Bible. Like, this isn't something where you could read it 5-10 different ways. Like, it's just straight up says, hey, you may purchase these people, keep them for life, treat them with rigor, but you may never do this to your fellow Israelites.
So you're telling me that there were special rules for Jews, as if this was a racist legal system?
And I think that's the thing that probably people miss the most here. And I hear this all the time, even in a recent debate that Skylar and I did. And that is that, well, it's not so bad, right? It's not antebellum slavery. And not only that, but it's much, much better than
you're not making a statement that it's not that bad. You're saying that this is what we hear.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. And secondly, the other thing that I hear all the time is that, well, yeah, sure, maybe they had slavery, but it was so much better than the other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And
you mean that old time slavery?
Yeah. What I think is most distressing about it is while there may be certain aspects of the way that antebellum slavery played out practically that were different than how the laws were set in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. That doesn't wash away the fact that there was debt slavery and that there was chattel slavery, as Skylar said very clearly. I mean, I think it's very clear there in Leviticus 25, and that's just one place that it exists, is that people were owned, and they were owned as property, and they were purchased with silver.
And you could bequeath them to your heirs.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Unless you're Jewish. Because if Jewish, you got an out, but then there's a loophole, even in the loophole, where you can even keep your Jews.
Yeah, yeah.
You trick them into marrying giving them a wife.
Yeah, now we know what we're talking about, but remember the audience doesn't. So, guys, please explain what that means.
Do you want me to do it, Josh? Or
go for it. Yeah.
So, Josh, you may have to give me the scripture number for us to actually read it, but basically, there is a verse where it talks about how if the slave master gives their slave a wife, and then now they have children, the slave now has the ability to ask to continue to be in slavery, right, permanently, because obviously he doesn't want to lose his wife and kids. He loves those people now. And they're basically, it's not, I guess, quote unquote, forced in a sense, but you're giving them basically a decision they can't refuse.
Well, let me look at the options. Yeah. Okay. We keep your wife, we keep your children. Mm-hmm. You just lose your home, and you get your freedom. You have no skills, but we will turn you out to be homeless in the wilderness without your family. Sound like a great deal?
Yeah, I mean, it's so there essentially there are two types of slaves that we see in the biblical text, and what Skylar's referencing there is Exodus 21, and that's one of the big passages that we always go to. And
so this is part of the 10 commandments that is really 30 something.
Yeah, it's right? I think it ends up being something like 613 ultimately, with the
just in that Exodus 20 through.
Oh no, just the totality, I think, of the law.
I never counted them, but I realized that Exodus 20 had 14 commandments in it, not 10. And then, of course, the list continues in subsequent chapters.
And what's interesting about it is, and you can see it, I think, very clearly, is that the law develops even throughout the Pentateuch, even throughout the Torah. So, Exodus 21, which is arguably the earliest, it's called the Covenant Code. You have essentially the law says if you're an Israelite, if an Israelite sells himself to you, you can keep him for 6 years as a slave, but in the 7th year, he has to go free. Now, if he comes in single, he goes out single. If he comes in with a wife, he goes out with his wife. But as you see a couple verses later, there were female slaves all the time that were owned by masters. And part of the ways, and in fact, I'd say it's arguably substantially one of the most popular ways to increase your slave holdings is to have slaves procreate that you own. And so the text says if that debt slave that comes in is given a wife by the master and they have children, they're his, they're the master's, and that's it. There's no real way around that. So as you say, Aaron, the guy's faced with a choice. Now, when he goes out, he might be able to go back to his field. Of course, he's released free without his debt anymore, so he can go back to farming his land. But he might love his wife and his kids and say, yeah, I don't really want to go out. So he's got to make that decision. Do I go out and leave him behind? Or do I just pledge myself to my master and have a ceremony done, and I'm a slave for life?
And I'm sure that's done with a handshake, right?
Go ahead, Skylar.
No, just like a pat on the back. Good luck, and on out to the world. You got this.
So how do they actually come to this arrangement?
Yeah, so they in Exodus 21 and in Deuteronomy 15, which again is a slightly later text. They're taken to the door of the either of the house or later of the temple or the tabernacle, and they have their ear pierced with an awl. And I think it's we can't know for certain, but looking at other ancient Near Eastern parallels to this is probably either it's a mark of some sort. There might be a tag that's hung through the ear, through the loop in the ear, to identify this person as a chattel slave. A permanent slave, or it might be an identifying mark of the master. It's sort of difficult to know with certainty. But the interesting thing about this is that when you get to the latest text, right, Leviticus 25, this text, there's several articles that have been written about this pretty recently, actually. 2014, I think, was the most recent, where it's arguing, and I think very convincingly, that the author of Leviticus 25 is well aware of Exodus 21, and that this serve for 6 years, but you can make an Israelite an eved, a slave. In Leviticus 25, essentially he says, no, you can't make Israelites eveds anymore. If they become so destitute that they have to sell themselves to you, you have to treat them as a hired worker. You have to pay them wages. But then, as Skylar pointed out, it says, now, as for your eveds, your male slaves, and your female slaves, they will come from the nations around you and from those tenant farmers, foreigners that are dwelling in the land with you. You may also take from them.
Now, what do you mean take from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. So
is there like a slave market where these people just line up wanting to be sold?
No, it's probably a little more complicated than that. One of the things that we do know is that they were purchased. The word there in the Hebrew is kana, and it can mean to acquire.
Now, these people were very often captured by one means or another. I mean, I've read several stories about how people are captured all over the place, where they're just walking down the road and they get abducted, and the next thing you know, they're a slave. Yeah,
I mean, there are proverbs in the ancient Near East that say a citizen in a foreign country is a slave. And that idea it's one of the things that the law didn't necessarily condone it in the ancient Near East in any country. There were always provisions in place to try to protect foreigners. I mean, it was just good business because a lot of those foreigners were merchants, and so to facilitate trade and whatnot. But the reality was that a person that's a citizen in one country goes to a foreign country, their protections are gone unless the ruler of that land goes out of his way, which is what they were supposed to do to protect them. But no, you had people, you see it in the Joseph story. Joseph is sold by his brothers to a band of merchants that are coming by. This was the common practice. Now, the question that the apologist always is going to come back to is, well, what did the law say? Not what happened, but what did God want to happen? The problem is that Abraham owned and purchased slaves with money. With silver, the law stipulated very clearly that a priest he had to do certain things in order for his slaves who were houseborn or purchased with silver in order for them to take part in some of the ceremonies. And even purportedly Solomon, writing the book of Ecclesiastes, says, I had so many slaves, both houseborn and purchased with silver. It was a great thing, because this was how the economy worked. And so to try to make this argument that slaves in foreign countries were not sold to Israelites, the big difference that you see in Leviticus 25, and then Skylar, I promise I'll be quiet.
Yeah, no, please.
The big difference in Leviticus 25 is that the text says you can no longer, essentially the author is saying you can no longer make Hebrews, Israelites, slaves. You have to treat them as hired workers. If you want slaves, you have to take them from foreigners that are either outside of the land, go buy them, or you take them as indentured servants in your land. But the big difference is you can keep them for life. That's it.
Well, which commandment was it that where God said, no, to hell with this, owning people is immoral? So which commandment did he say it is immoral to own people? I will no longer allow this.
Skylar, where is that? Third Moses? Is that where it is?
Yeah. Probably in Christians' heads is probably where that commandment lives.
Okay. So you're saying that Christ was the one who said that slavery was immoral and that it was immoral to own people.
Skylar, I think he knows the answer.
Yeah, I think he does. And one caveat I might say to what Josh was saying about the Israelites, the one exception would be women, because women were basically sold without any kind of consent. And what I challenge people and challenge Christians quite a bit. I'm like, show me one time in the Bible where you find consensual marriage in there. I've had people kind of try to bring arguments, but I don't think they follow through with it. But you look at what would happen to women, even within the Israeli culture, where fathers would go into debt, and then in order to get out of debt, would sell their daughters into basically marriage or a certain kinds of forms of slavery. And of course, now there were certain rules where, they had to treat them a little better. Like if they didn't, if the girls weren't doing to their liking, they would have to, let them go for free and basically.
Yeah. So that was the thing I wanted to ask you about. So that was one of my questions that I brought up. Or that I was thinking about, that the father sells his daughter into slavery. And if the master does not, what is this? There's something about if the master, if she doesn't please the master, and we know what the implication is there, right? Then he's going to set her loose. But he's going to turn some young girl loose in the wilderness. Get out.
Well, and she probably can't remarry either. Like she's not a virgin anymore.
Exactly.
So she's already tamed her. Yeah.
She's worthless goods. She's also what, 12, 13?
Probably.
Right. Yeah. So the master's now, maybe he's spent with this girl. He doesn't like her, whatever. Maybe they had an argument. Is that even possible? So, you looked me straight in the eye instead of down at the floor. Get the hell out of my house, whatever. Now you've got a homeless 12 or 13-year-old girl who is worthless and alone. And she can't go back to her family. She has no value to anybody. So what else is she going to do?
Yeah. I mean, the provisions are, and again, looking at it from an ancient Near Eastern context, they would say, well, this is how things are done, and it would be perfectly acceptable. There were provisions that were put in place. So the master, he could say, I'm going to give her to my son, but if he took another wife, he couldn't diminish certain things, and it's kind of debated what the text means there. But if he didn't provide three things for her, then he either had to free her or let her be redeemed back to her family. But again, as you guys say, there are real problems with that because, again, she's lost a shit ton of value, right? And that it's sad that's how that's viewed, her value. But as Skylar,
it's kind of like buying a used car.
And I think what's worse about it, and as bad as that is, somebody brought this up and stated it, I think, in a very clear way. Well, what if the master did like her, and maybe he didn't treat her very well, but he didn't treat her poorly, and he kept these three things that he's supposed to have coming toward her coming. Could she leave? No. I mean, the text says very clearly at the end of the 6 years, the amahs, the female slaves, they do not go out as the male slaves do. They don't.
Okay, so just to clarify, so we get a 12-year-old girl sold to a 54-year-old man, and as long as he likes her, everything's fine. Nobody asks whether she likes him.
That's correct.
Right. That doesn't matter.
No.
Okay, just to make sure that the footing is straight. Here, go ahead.
Well, and that's probably in two. Just remember, that's probably like a Hebrew girl, right? Because then if they go to war and they decide he comes across a captive that he takes a liking to, like he doesn't have to, they can't. If she doesn't like it, he doesn't have to. Those rules don't apply. Basically, like he could just take her. The only thing that God says that he has to allow her to do is mourn her mother and father for the people that the Israelites have just now killed. Basically, everybody in the village.
We're talking about prisoners of war now.
Yes.
See,
that opens up a whole nother one.
See, go ahead.
I brought this thing up before. In what is it, Numbers 31? Where they wipe out all the Midianites, and then Moses demands that, why the hell are you being merciful? Murder the sons in front of their mothers and slaughter and butcher the mothers in front of the daughters. But if the daughters are preteen virgins, you can use them however is your pleasure. And I'm told by Christians that these girls were not underage, because that would be the immoral part, or for whatever reason, sacking the village, killing grandma was not a problem. Burning everything to the ground, stealing all of the stuff, that's not a problem. You can justify butchering the little boys and the mothers, all somehow that's justifiable in righteousness, but sex is never justifiable. That's just always immoral. And then there's the problem with being underage. So some Christians have told me that each of the girls at Numbers 31 were at least 20 years old.
Wow.
So
I wonder where they'd even get those numbers, like where they'd pull that out of.
Because it does say in one translation, it says infant children or the girl infants, and another one says the girls among the little ones, right? Excuse me, little ones.
Yeah, the Hebrew word. It's actually read the passage because there were rules for engagement. This is why I struggle with this label of prisoners of war, because it conjures up this idea that you have men fighting men who are being taken captive, and that's not what the text says. So Deuteronomy 20 verse 10: when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, if they surrender, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. So they'll pay tribute or they'll do corvée labor. Verse 12, if they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. Emasculate it, right? As for the women and the children, and this is the word, if I'm remembering it correctly, the word taf, and taf is like the little ones. The livestock and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. So, the idea that and it says, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you want to
clarify. I want to clarify something. When we're talking about the little ones, as the Bible describes among these girls, so we're definitely not talking about 18 or 20-year-old women, right?
No, and I'm actually flipping back through the.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because the way that I understand the division in Hebrew tradition between the little ones and the big ones would be the bat mitzvah, right? And we're talking about 12, and what is it, 12 in a day or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, modern Jewish tradition might be slightly different with the age, but this is the word taf, and taf, it means the little ones. It means like little kids. It's not like a yeled or a yalda.
And for whatever reason, the little kids have to be virgin.
Well, and this follows like a motif of other parts of the Bible also. It's not like God is notorious for ordering human beings to kill children and babies multiple times if he's not doing it himself. So like it's really, I don't understand when people try to even argue against it and think that why these people would be older. It's like you can go to plenty of other examples in the Bible where God has human beings just execute children just to get rid of everybody.
Yeah, well, wait, I mean, Numbers 5 allows, has God endorsing abortion over something as trivial as infidelity.
accusation of infidelity.
Yeah, tell Alabama or Ohio or any of
Yeah.
these recent states that are trying to pass these anti-abortion laws, get them to explain, Numbers 5. They won't. They will insist, well, it doesn't say she was pregnant. Yeah, but it doesn't say she wasn't pregnant either. And she is most likely pregnant if the husband suspects that she was cheating. And if this potion would cause the womb to discharge and the fetus to rot and fall away, well, then there's got to be a fetus in there, right? But you can never get them to admit that obvious answer. It'll never happen.
And I think there's even a more telling problem that maybe is a little harder to piece together. But Exodus 21 has the discussion about two men that struggle and hit a woman that is with child. And when you look at their ancient Near Eastern law texts, this is probably relegating the fetus to a less than human position. So I mean, I think that.
Well, yeah, because you have to change. You have to pay for damages.
It's
right?
treated as it's treated as a property, and it's similar, I guess, in a sense to verse 32 later on in the chapter where it talks about the goring ox, right? And if a goring ox who is known to gore gores another citizen, essentially another free man, then the owner is killed, right? Or if the family that is left behind decides, all right, we don't want the owner of the ox to die. We want him to pay a really hefty, payment to us to get out of dying. Then he can do that. But then verse 32 said, and if that ox kills a slave, gores a slave, and it dies, you have to pay 30 shekels of silver, right? Which is the price of a slave. Hmm. So a slave is not considered, and it's a property. It's property damage.
Yeah.
It's property law. So. But those things, to me, are so very striking, not in their ancient Near Eastern context, because they're exactly what we would expect in the ancient Near Eastern context. This is how things were done. But when you try to come at that text and say, "Oh no, God is, this is the one moral standard. This is the objective moral standard that never changes, and we can use it today," it's like, whoa, not really,
because God is unchanging, and that's why He changed His pact with Jesus, having a new covenant.
Well, one of the things that we try to do is when we try to explain to people is at least one of the things I think is very important to us is that we get people just to realize that this was just an ancient culture, right? And this was what was going on at the time. They were cruel to women. They accepted slavery. There was genocide. There's all types of things happening. It's not because we're here just to be like, look at your mean old God up there and he's so bad and so terrible. It's like we don't believe in the God, right? But what I want, at least what I want from Christians to do is I want you to kind of at least think better of the God you believe in, right? You don't have to, you could believe in a God and not believe that he wants to murder children or, is pro-slavery or all kinds of fun things. I mean, you look at 2 Samuel, right? We're talking about, like abortion. God literally kills a baby to punish the sins of the father.
And some pretty horrific sins.
Yeah. In 7 days, I think it was 7 days the baby was sick for, right? When God says in other parts of the Bible, he won't punish people for the sins of their father, yet he physically makes the baby sick.
You mean there are places where the Bible contradicts itself?
A couple.
It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe, but it's there. But I mean, this is the whole thing. I mean, this is why God's morality is all over the place, right? You think of one of the excuses that I hear so often when we talk about these slavery things is they'll argue that, well, this was the best situation for the people at the time because they were poor and they would have starved to death, whether it's like the war situation or like the indentured servitude. But this is a God who could create universes.
Let's look at that for a moment. Yeah. Let's talk about the indentured servitude for a moment. Let's say you are impoverished, you are homeless, you are destitute, you've got nothing, and you're asking somebody, please help me. We'll work for food, right? You got the little cardboard sign there, and somebody says, okay, I'll put you up in my house, I'll feed you, you work for me. Is that endangered servitude? Indentured. Sorry. I mean, no. At what point is the person not free to leave? I mean, the exchange is housing and food, right? Mm-hmm. For work.
Yeah, let's take for those listening that are of the more Christian persuasion and are really fighting against this. Let's go outside of the Bible. Let's talk about Nuzi, right? Another ancient Near Eastern culture. In Nuzi, you have what they call adoption contracts, and these adoption contracts are essentially the person that's probably destitute is saying to the older people, generally speaking, "Hey, look, I'll adopt me, and what I'll do is I'll be your slave until you die. I'll take care of you. I'll feed you. I'll work. I'll maintain you, and then you take care of me. And I'll take care of you until you die, and I'll take care of all your burial provisions, all that stuff." They had a contract that they signed, and that person was enslaved. Now, if that person reneged, if they went back on the deal, there were severe penalties for that. But that's adoption in the ancient world, right? This is not slavery. And slavery was a separate category. It was a separate issue. But even in an adoption, there were severe penalties for both parties because
we have a situation now. I mean, like you're a young man and you've got no prospects. You're homeless. You've got no job. What do? You can agree. You sign a contract with somebody that, you house me, you feed me, I'll go where you want to do, I will risk my life for you. And the recruiter says, you're in the army now.
Yeah.
So that's the way that works. But that's not slavery.
No.
Right. So we've got a contract, and people can walk from that contract. Severe penalties apply for early withdrawal. Yeah. But yes, but that's not slavery. But now, how is slavery in the Bible significantly different, or is it different than slavery that we had in the United States?
So I would say, sort of to talk about the first point, we can see this in practice in the biblical text. So if you go to Jeremiah 34, for example, I don't remember which verses, but you see the prophet railing against the people because the Israelites have taken other Israelites and have kept them past the 6-year point, right? Haven't set them free.
The fact used by,
but the fact that the slave couldn't leave, right? You would think that if the law said 6 years ago, and that as many apologists would say, well, Deuteronomy 23 says that they can leave, they can just run away. These people couldn't leave. As a matter of fact, Jeremiah 34 says that the people felt bad and set because of what Jeremiah said and set the slaves free, and then went, never mind. And they went back and took them again. So this is not like come and go as you please. If things get really bad again, they could not go. And I think that's the point. Now, one thing that I do think is important, and then Skylar, I'll turn it over to you. Please, take time. One of the things that I think is important is we always hear, there was somebody that recently put a series of videos out that we're going to talk about. And we're going to do some reviews on. There's a guy named What Do You Meme? And he was criticizing Cosmic Skeptic's video, who was criticizing somebody else. I can't remember. And one of the
vicious circle.
Indeed. And one of the things that I hear is, well, it's not as bad as antebellum slavery, therefore it's not bad. And part of the thing that I think we need to, number one, I think we need to really identify what antebellum slavery was like, distinguishing it from what were the laws. And I'm not an American history scholar by any means. So what I would want to know is, what were the laws on the books? I'm sure they were terrible, but what were the laws on the books, and how did they differ from what was actually practiced?
Okay, because I can tell you this. I mean, I've read documents that were published by the American government. Coincidentally, one that I read was published on the day that Charles Darwin was born, and I thought it was funny that Christians were blaming Darwin for racism or for having invented racism, which I thought that was brilliant. But there was this document that talked about breeding African Americans, right? Breeding our African import slaves and referring to them as cattle. Referring to them as being no different than the language was completely dehumanizing. If they produce spawn, their calves, whatever, belong to, and the language was insidious because these are people, and you're describing them as though they're heifers and calves.
Yeah.
And the language was obviously meant to taint the mind of the person at the time, to not acknowledge these as people, to completely dehumanize them. And I've seen that in other people's writing. There's actually quite a long history of dehumanizing other people and referring to them as, like Voltaire, an atheist back in the day, who said that he remarked that when black people move to northern climes, that they don't turn white immediately. He said that they still reproduce after their own species.
Wow.
So that's just the way people thought, and that went all the way back into Rome. I've read documents, from the Romans complaining about the Northerners, saying that they were more reddish colored because they had more blood. So there's all kinds of racism, just commonly. When the Spanish first came over to this country, there's a lot of documents describing the Native Americans as being equivalent to parrots that can mimic human speech, but that they were not actually human. They were just talking animals.
Jeez.
And this was written by the church at a time before. I think this was before Lutheran or Luther. So this was the example of Christianity in the Western world, and it was dehumanizing blacks, and it was dehumanizing Native Americans. And they had this, I forget what the name of it is, but if you invade any country that is not a Christian country, then you treat those people as animals and make them your subjects, for they now belong to you. Anybody? I don't remember if either of you remembers there was a pope that put a name on this policy.
I don't remember what it is. I know they did stuff like that in Rwanda too. Was another issue. Is that's when they split up the two tribes there. Basically, they would measure their noses, and whoever had the largest nose, they would basically were the subservient ones. They would take the people who were more white looking, I guess, for lack of better phrasing there. But I would say, you asked a question of, like, what are the similarities between American slavery and some of the slavery in the Old Testament?
How dare you go back on topic?
Sorry. No, I've been thinking about it. I wanted to make sure I get this out, right? Because I think there are a couple major things that are almost exact, right? One, people were treated as property, right? People could be owned for life. Children could be owned as property. And then you could pass off people as permanent inheritance to your ancestors. So you look at the bit like that, that's four major parts of slavery. Well, other things too. You could beat your slaves, right? You can't kill them, but you could beat them with a rod.
There was one difference. One difference between the slavery of people and the subjugation of animals is that people would look down on you if you fucked your sheep.
Sure. Yeah, that's
true. The little girls, no matter how you acquired them, even if you murdered their parents right in front of them, they belong to you.
No, yeah, it was definitely a very brutal culture in many ways, both in American slavery and obviously in the ancient Hebrew cultures. But I mean, this is what you should expect, right? You have people that are very uneducated. There's not a lot of information. They're only usually probably in one specific part of the world. They probably can't travel that far, especially if you're poor. Most of them probably couldn't read or write. They had probably little to no understanding of the world around them. And it was basically
my family.
And I think one of the things that we should be, and I'm thinking about this from a defensive posture, I suppose. One of the things we need to be careful of is not letting the argument go in sort of the direction of a red herring. So, one of the things that I hear, and I heard it in this recent video I was just talking about, is that, well, such and such believes that the slave was owned as property. That meant you could beat them mercilessly as much as you want. You could do whatever you wanted. You could treat them like an old couch, for example. They had absolutely no rights, right? And then if you set those two things up as straw men, then if you go and you find a passage in the Bible where it says that they have a right, well, then there was no slavery. Well, that's just it's a straw man argument. To be owned as property, the biblical legal texts are a little confused, right? They just are. They, as you said, Aaron, they contradict. Depends on where you are. If you're in Exodus, if you're in Deuteronomy, it's particularly if you're in Leviticus 25, the text changes, right? It has different ways to approach the problem, and one's, I think, a polemic against the other. But you also have this difficulty with understanding the distinction between chattel. How can someone be chattel, be property, and yet the master couldn't do absolutely whatever they wanted to them, and that's just the case, right? You see this in the laws of Hammurabi, for example. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted to your slave. Now you could do a lot to them, but
Are you saying that there was another set of laws before the 10 Commandments?
Quite a few, yeah. And it's interesting because even the earlier ones, for example, the laws of Eshnuna, which early second millennium, you have passages that talk about protecting the foreigner, protecting the underprivileged,
Well,
not
now you're sounding awfully leftist now.
Yeah, right. But so many people come to me and say, look at Leviticus 19:33. It says, love the foreigner, love the resident alien, love him as yourself. How could you have slavery if it...
Tell that to Trump. I'm sorry. I just had to put things in context for a moment.
But this was the cultural milieu. This is what kings were supposed to do. They were supposed to protect foreigners, and not just in the Bible, not just everywhere in the ancient Near East. You see this. So slaves had rights. They might not have had a lot of rights, but to say that, if they're property, which they clearly were, that meant that they could be beaten mercilessly. And as long as you didn't poke out an eye or knock out a tooth, that meant you could.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the limit. You were not allowed to beat your slave so savagely that it knocked out his eye.
Yeah.
Or that it killed him. The slave had to be able to get up in 1 or 2 days.
Yeah.
So the Bible says that you can beat someone to a coma, and that they had better get up before their body is depleted of water before they can drink again, or they'll die. Right? Am I reading this wrong? Is there another way to interpret this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably...
That sounds pretty fucking savage to me.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely... I definitely would say by today's moral standards, it would be imprisonment. And so the rationale behind this...
Don't we criminalize people who treat dogs that way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you read Proverbs 29, one among many passages, it says explicitly that if a slave that is pampered from youth will become insolent, right? And slaves don't learn; they don't understand by words alone. So the anticipation is that they're going to be beaten, and this is what as a form of discipline. But in the same way, maybe not in the same way, but with the same tool that is used to beat children. Right, you beat them with this wooden rod, and the
spare the rod, spoil the child, because people don't learn through reason.
Yeah,
you have to beat them.
Yeah, and
I'm embarrassed to say, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
I know you have a track that you're going on, but if you just set me off on a tangent. I was trained, conditioned, if you will, that you're supposed to beat children. I was beaten myself. I was spanked, and I was lashed with the belt, the thing where you have to pull down. You have to go out and find the switch.
Go get me something to spank you with.
Strip the switch. It had to make that certain whoop noise in the air before Grandma would use it on you. Pull your pants down, and then never hit your butt for whatever. She always gets the back of your thighs. Damn it, Grandma, get your aim together. But I was told that children cannot be reasoned with. But I've grown up and discovered it is possible to reason with children.
Yeah.
And I raised kids that I've never spanked. That we have an agreement. We can intellectualize things. We can actually discuss things. And I realize there are problem children, but I think the problem children may largely stem from problem parents. My parents did the last resort as the first option, having no way of explaining their position or why I should respect it. I fortunately didn't have that disability, and I'm sorry to go off on that tangent, but I was actually taught at one time that this was accepted, this is expected, you are supposed to spank your children. That's what I was told as a little kid, and that's what I grew up believing. And fortunately, I got over that. Shortly after I had my own kids, I figured out this is not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And this is definitely the message of Proverbs. I mean, there's no question about it. In fact, the text says, and I don't remember the chapter.
Are you telling me that the Bible is wrong?
Well, it's challenged, maybe. I don't know.
Certainly endorses things we wouldn't endorse.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, I was going to say something really, really quickly.
Yeah, please.
Because it reminded me, Aaron, of when I was watching a documentary on the Shaolin monks, like how they train. And there was an American dude who went over there to kind of like learn and train with him. And one of the things that he had to get used to was they beat basically people that they are training. Like they'll literally beat them up at times. If they mess up, they continue to mess up. And it's very difficult for people who go over there and that aren't used to that kind of weird. It's a unique kind of cultural thing. And in the same sense, I guess, when you look at probably even much more barbaric in the Old Testament. But this kind of shows you that this is all just kind of relative in a sense when you talk about morality and rules and like what people find to be okay and good. It changes throughout history. Yeah. And this is what we need to look at when we look at the lens of the Bible. We got to look at listen, once again, it's not about your God being real or fake. It's most likely fake. It's the idea that this is just people. This is the people that lived in those times. This is what they did. This is how they acted. So this is nothing new to them. And if you see throughout the Bible, they're hurting children or, owning slaves, that's the ancient Near East, basically.
Yeah, that's
right. I can tell you that the way I learned to drive, my dad taught me to drive when I was 12 years old. And if I ever put one foot on the gas pedal and one foot on the brake at the same time, he would punch me in the shoulder.
Wow.
I was 12.
My dad would do this thing where I'd get spanked a little bit when I was a kid, but not too heavily. But when I got to be a teenager, and I was a badass teenager, I remember him bringing boxing gloves home and a boxing helmet. And he's like, I want to teach you how to box. But it ended up turning into this thing where...
But only when you do something wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was a mistake my stepdad did. My stepdad made a big mistake. I shouldn't be telling this right now, but my stepdad was evil and stupid. And I was not at all. I think I actually drank a beer in his honor when he died because the bastard was dead. But I lost all respect for him when he punched me in the face. And I said, "That's it? That's all you got?" And I put him through a wall. He put me through a door. It got bad. Wow. It got bad. But I lost all respect for him at that moment. He could have lorded over me how much badder he was than I was. But he went and made the mistake of showing it.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
And then there was that's it. You're done.
Yeah. At that point, yeah. That's got to be the end of the relationship in that sense. Yeah, luckily I got a helmet to put on, so it's like when I got.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? When he punched me, he punched my teeth through my lip. So with my mouth closed, one of my teeth is coming out through the top part of my lip, and I'm still laughing at how weak he was.
Jeez.
And I was just a teenager.
Yeah.
And I'm serious. I put him through a door that was closed.
Wow.
But anyway, enough about that.
Well, if you were living in biblical times, you would have been executed for being
that's right.
a child. So
yeah. I think it's the fourth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. This has always confused me. Honor your father and thy mother so that you will live a long life. Right?
Yeah.
Well, then I forget what in Leviticus, Deuteronomy at least, and I don't remember what the other one is, but there's two passages that say exactly what that means, which is disobedient children will be put to death.
Yeah, Exodus 21.
So if you're not, thank you. If you're not obedient to your parents, they will kill you. So honor your father, your mother, and that's the only way that you'll live a long life.
Yeah.
You think about that reasoning, like how human beings must have reasoned that out back then. Like, I mean, listen, my kids can be terrible sometimes. I got 2 kids that can drive me up a wall. But I couldn't imagine a moment where I was like, had enough. This is it. Today's the day you get executed, children, for disobeying me and being so disobedient. Like, I told you fucking 10 o'clock, you go to sleep. It's now 10:15. Now you're getting executed. I'll try this over with one of my slave girls. We'll see what happens. You know?
Yeah, the whole concept of while we're talking, you know, I'm weighing all of this against the notion of objective morality.
Yeah.
That's the funniest thing to me. Some Christian apologist challenged me to debate her against on whether she has objective morality. I'm like, oh yeah, it's on. I'm definitely doing that debate. Set up the venue. I'll go to your town. I'll give you 60% of the take on the ticket sales. I'll only take 40% of the profits. We'll definitely do that. And she backed down after I saw on Twitter dozens of people telling her, you're going to lose. There's no way to defend this position. You're done.
Especially, it's just so contradictory when you look at the Bible. Like, over and over again, God contradicts himself, especially morally with people. Like, I don't even know how the Christians can even think they have a leg to stand on when it comes to it.
Well, what's the definition of objective, right? And that means that it's not dependent on anyone's personal opinion, right? This is something that can be verified outside of personal opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like in a collective of people may be able to show different reasons why to advocate this or that position or to discredit this other position. But Christian morality states it's whatever God says.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that mean that it's God's subjective opinion?
Yeah.
There you go. No objective morality for you.
They may make some kind of weird argument where they'll say that it's rooted in God's nature, and then whatever he says comes from his very being. But even that's contradictory, because then, like, I always go after the kid stuff, because it's like God says he loves children, yet look at the way he treats children. Right? And if I use the biblical definition of love from Corinthians, love is kind, love is gentle, love is patient, and then I go to 1 Samuel where he tells you to go kill a bunch of infants and kids, like, is that kind? Is that gentle? Is that patient? Right?
Okay, so when you said that God loves children, of course, my first thought was Catholic priests. But then, subsequent to that, I have also seen a lot of very similar news stories about evangelical ministers. The difference being that it was underage girls. So the one way to tell Catholics from Protestant clergy is which gender of children they molest the most.
That's sad.
So we were talking about objective morality.
Well, you know what I was going to say, that there's one more thing I would say is, remember, and then there's the kind of Christianity like Calvinism where God can hate children, where, like, there are people that he hates, there are kids that he hates. And, you know, because of his decretive will, those kids will go through enormous amounts of suffering, and when they die, they will burn in eternity, because that's the way God wanted it. That's the way he hated them before they were born, and he'll continue to hate them, and he'll make them suffer for the way that he made them, for some weird backwards ass reason.
So for the way that he made them. So God decides who believes and who doesn't, right? So
before they're even born,
there's special rules for Jewish slaves that don't apply to anybody else, because Jews are the chosen people. They're God's favorite race. So again, slavery is racist. Go figure. What a surprise that is.
It's almost as if human beings wrote the book.
Oh my gosh, it's almost like that. Yeah. Let's talk about the promised land, for example. I'm going to give you this promised land. Oh, there's a half a dozen tribes already living in that, but I'll send some angels to kill them all before you get there. And by the way, if you follow the coastline, it'll only take you 2 weeks to get there, because I work in delirious ways, then you will be lost in the desert for 40 years. And everybody that started the trek will be dead before we get there. But you'll have that promised land, and I'll just have to wipe out everybody that's already there in order for you to get it. And by the way, that I mentioned, you're going to have to kill tens of thousands of people on your own to get there.
But it won't be genocide. so don't worry.
Well, hey, I love you, Adam and Eve. You guys are my sacred children. I'm just going to let this serpent, though, that's my enemy, hang out with you guys down there for a little bit. And yeah, maybe he'll tempt you. I don't know, but he's got to do his thing. I'm letting him do his thing down there. And even though I see the future and I know he's going to trick you, and then lots of terrible things are going to happen, I'm going to let that go through.
So this is the same God that knows everything that is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
In advance. So he tells Adam and Eve what will happen. If you eat the fruit, in the day that you eat the fruit, you will surely die. Mm-hmm. And the serpent says, God's full of shit. You're not going to die. And then when it actually happens, God went and changed all the rules, and suddenly they're not dead. And suddenly they have labor in childbirth, and suddenly they have to sweat and toil and all like this. And so God made up a whole bunch of new rules after that happened. And then, I love this part, God says that he has to take Adam and Eve out of the garden before Adam eats of that other magical tree, the fruit of the tree of eternal life. Because if Adam eats of the fruit of the tree of eternal life, then he will live forever. Now, Christians modern Christians want to say that sin brought death into the world. But what would have happened if Adam had never eaten? He obviously hadn't eaten from the fruit of the tree of eternal life because God was going to prevent him from doing so. What if Adam had never eaten from either tree? If he hadn't eaten from the fruit of the tree of eternal life, then he wouldn't have had eternal life, right?
Well, and exactly. And think about this aspect of it, right? If there's no death, why is there a tree that if you eat from it, you live forever?
What if you never
there's no point of having a tree that makes you live forever if there's no death.
It's almost like it's almost like it's a myth.
It's strange that when you look at all of the Renaissance paintings, like all of them, like from all of the great masters of the Renaissance, why do every single one of them depict the temptation of Eve? Why do they always paint the serpent as a woman? And for those who haven't seen, the back cover of my book, the front cover of my book, both of them, front and back, show the temptation of Eve as depicted on the entrance to Notre Dame Cathedral. Now, I don't know if this is still there. I fortunately saw Notre Dame Cathedral before it burnt down. I don't know if this particular relief still exists, but they portrayed the serpent in the garden as quite an attractive female Naga, which is, you have the top half of the body of as a woman and the bottom half as a snake. And that was a common theme that was reproduced by everybody throughout the Renaissance. But we do seem to be straying off topic. We were talking about slavery.
There's so much to go over, just so many problems.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming up on an hour, and I want to be fair to everybody. I want to be fair to the both of you, and I hope that I haven't talked too much, although I fear that I already have.
No, it's been great.
I want both of you to get out whatever you want to finish about this. If there's anything that you meant to say, let's bring it forward. We'll go long if we have to, and I'll just try to do my best to shut up from here on.
Go ahead, Skylar.
I don't know if I have anything else I really want to hit upon. I think we've kind of, hit it. We talked about indentured servitude. We talked about women being sold into debt slavery because of their father. We talked about women being captured, made prisoners, and made into wives. Of course, there's children born into slavery. We talked a little bit about that concept of it. I would just once again just stress that, it's not about, it's more about just perspective, folks. Like, give up the book, give up the ghost, guys. You don't have to believe in a 2,000, older than thousands of year old book from many authors that are.
Don't give it 2,000. It really was only a compilation that is about 2,000 years old. 2,000. The oldest parts of it are only a century or two older than that.
Yeah, and you don't have to believe in it, folks. And that's the thing that I try to get across to people. Like, just read it. That's all I tell them. If you just read the thing, take the time to read it, know what's going on, and the faith will go away. I guess that's all I really have to say. I think,
bear in mind also that, comparative religion, I think, is enough to dissuade anybody from adopting any one religion. If you compare, Hindu religion or Sikh or Buddhist to Christianity and look at their origins, you're going to discover, especially if you go to the really old ones like Hellenist or Zoroastrian or Persian or Egyptian, especially for you Christians, you're going to discover an awful lot of disturbing parallels.
Yeah, and I think I would sort of kind of piggyback on that. And of course, I take have a special place in my heart for Mesopotamian religion. And I, if you want to understand, I think a topic like slavery, and even more so legal systems in general, and then of course literary and liturgical texts. The way that you do it is you go in the biblical text is you go back and you study the ancient Near East. So go get yourself Before the Muses by Foster, or go to Sumerian literary websites that you can see on our channel, Digital Hammurabi. Watch our channel. Watch Skylar's channel when we're talking about this stuff, and you'll see over and over again. If you read through these texts, you'll walk away going, "Well, people wrote that," and they're going to be so similar to the text when you come to the Bible. When you come to the biblical text, it'll seem so similar that you say, I wonder if that text is doing the same thing. And I just think that stepping out of this very fundamentalist viewpoint that says I have to believe these very strict things about the inerrancy of the text, the infallibility of the text, that God's nature is immutable, and that morality is objective and unchanging. If you can sort of loosen up a little bit on those things, at least it will let your faith develop in a way that I think is much more healthy. And again, maybe just lead down the road that it's led for most of us, not most, but many of us, and that is to either agnosticism or atheism. So yeah.
Stop living in fear.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nobody up there watching you. God doesn't care who you have sex with. He doesn't care what you eat. Just, try to be a good person according to your moral code. And yeah, like I think about like when I was a Christian for many, many years, and the amount of guilt I would feel about things and the amount of burden that religion would put on me. That wasn't all bad. Let me be fair, that there were lots of good times too. Like there were lots of good people that I met, and we went out as a church and we did a lot of nice things for people. But at the same time, people literally live in fear every day that like they may go to hell, or God may curse them or punish them, or lead them to just irrational beliefs like the earth is flat, or you name it these days that comes from the Bible. So yeah, I think that's it. That's all I would say. Like, you can do better.
All right,
folks.
I'm going to go ahead and close it up. Boys, it has been fun.
Thank you, Aaron.
Oh, thank you so much, man.
Thank you for being on.